The air at the McAllister farm auction in the spring of '71 hung thick with the smells of diesel exhaust, cheap cigars, and the sweet, cloying scent of damp earth finally giving way to the sun. It was a clearing out sale. Old man McAllister had finally given up the ghost, and his kids from the city wanted cash, not a collection of rusty iron and memories. Men in seed corn caps and grease-stained work coats milled around the hay racks, kicking tires and murmuring appraisals in low tones. Frank Miller stood near the back, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his worn canvas jacket. He wasn't here for the prime pieces. His eyes were fixed on a derelict-looking thing sitting off by the fence row, a farmall M that looked like it had been put out to pasture 20 years ago. The paint was a faded memory, a ghost of that classic International Harvester red, now mostly consumed by a creeping skin of rust. One rear tire was flat, the rubber cracked and split like an old man's heel. The engine was half disassembled, the head sitting cockeyed on the block, draped in a rotten burlap sack. To most, it was a 2-ton paperweight. To Frank, it was potential. A shadow fell over him, smelling of expensive aftershave and ambition. Still shopping in the boneyard, Frank? Frank didn't need to turn. He knew that voice. Harold Vance. Harold was everything Frank wasn't. Where Frank's 320 acres were his, paid for by his father's sweat and his own, Harold was farming nearly 1,000 acres, most of it rented, all of it leveraged. "It's got a good straight frame, Harold," Frank said, his voice a low rumble. "Wide front end is solid. That's worth something." Harold let out a short, derisive laugh. "It's worth scrap price, and you know it. Why you waste your time with this junk is beyond me." He gestured with his chin toward the front line of equipment, where the real action was. Sitting there, gleaming under the midday sun, was a John Deere 4430, barely 2 years old, its green paint so bright it hurt the eyes. It had the sound guard cab, air conditioning, a radio. It was a spaceship compared to the open station tractors most men in the county were still running. "Now that," Harold said, his voice thick with desire, "is a machine. That's how you make money in this business. Efficiency, power. You can run that thing 16 hours straight and not even break a sweat." Frank just nodded slowly, his gaze still on the old farmall. He knew the 4430. A good tractor, no doubt. But he also knew what it cost. A man could buy a decent house for the price of that machine. It represented a mortgage, a monthly payment that didn't care if it rained too much or not enough, if the price of corn was up or in the tank. It was a chain around your neck, painted green and yellow. The auctioneer's patter picked up as he reached the John Deere. The bidding was fast and furious. Harold Vance stood tall, his arm shooting up, his voice clear and confident. He was bidding against the co-op manager and a big operator from the next county over. Frank watched him, a knot tightening in his gut. Harold was a good farmer. Frank had to give him that. He worked hard. But he was playing a dangerous game, betting the farm on high prices and cheap credit. The bidding climbed past 15,000, then 16. Finally, the gavel fell. "Sold to Mr. Harold Vance for $17,500. A round of applause and backslapping followed Harold as he walked over to sign the papers. He caught Frank's eye and gave a triumphant smirk. An hour later, the crowd had thinned. The auctioneer, a tired man named Bill Peters, finally got to the junk line. "All right, boys, what am I bid for this old International? Good for parts, or a project for a fellow with more time than sense?" A few chuckles ran through the remaining farmers. $50, someone yelled from the back. "I got 50, who'll give 75? Frank raised a single finger. 100. The other bidder shrugged and dropped out. "Sold. To Frank Miller for $100. Bill Peters banged his gavel, eager to be done for the day. As Frank paid his bill, Harold Vance walked by, shaking his head in mock pity. $100 for a pile of rust. And I thought I was the gambler, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. You could have put that 100 down on a real tractor, Frank. The bank's loaning money hand over fist these days. You're living in the past. Frank carefully folded his receipt and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He looked Harold square in the eye. My past is paid for, Harold. Can you say the same about your future? Harold's smile tightened. He didn't have an answer for that. He just turned and walked away toward his new green machine. Frank spent the rest of the afternoon getting his purchase ready for the trip home. He aired up the one good tire and wrestled the flat one, its bead fused to the rusty rim, off the tractor. He borrowed a spare from a neighbor who was still at the sale, promising to bring it back the next day. He chained the farmall's solid front axle to the back of his old C60 Chevrolet grain truck, the one with the tired 292 inline-six and the 4-speed transmission that whined in third gear. The drive home was slow, the truck groaning under the strain, the old red tractor swaying behind him like a loyal, wounded animal. He pulled into his own lane just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. His farm wasn't flashy. The barn needed a coat of paint, and the house was a simple, sturdy 2-story box his grandfather had built. But every post, every board, every acre of black dirt was his. No banker held a note on it. No finance company could come and take it away. He parked the truck and its burden next to his machine shed, the big sliding doors gaping open to reveal the silhouettes of his own iron family, his John Deere 4-20, the workhorse he'd bought used but in good shape 10 years ago, his old Farmall H, which he used for cultivating and odd jobs, and his Gleaner E combine, small and simple, but a machine he knew inside and out. They weren't new. They weren't fancy. But they were his. He stood there for a long time in the fading light, the cool spring air raising goosebumps on his arms. He looked at the rusted hulk he'd just dragged home, and then across the section to the west, where he could just make out the gleaming shape of Harold Vance's brand-new John Deere sitting in his yard, a monument to modern agriculture and modern debt. A quiet war had been declared today, though only Frank seemed to realize it. A war of philosophies, old iron versus new steel, calloused hands versus a checkbook. Now, before we go any further, I have to ask you folks listening, what's the one old piece of machinery you'd never part with? The one you know inside and out? The one that never let you down? Maybe it's an old Ford 8N, a farmall cub, or a beat-up pickup truck you learned to drive in. Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'd love to hear your stories. Frank's workshop was his sanctuary. It was a long, low-slung building he'd built himself out of reclaimed lumber and corrugated steel. The air inside was thick with the ghosts of projects past, the sharp tang of cutting oil, the acrid smell of welding flux, the comforting aroma of old grease, and the faint scent of wood smoke from the cast-iron stove that squatted in the corner. Along one wall, wrenches, sockets, and pliers hung in meticulous order on a pegboard, their outlines traced in black paint, so he knew instantly if something was missing. On the other side, a heavy-duty workbench held a massive vise, a drill press, and a grinder. In the center of the concrete floor, under a single bare bulb hanging from a cord, sat the heart of the Farmall M, its engine hoisted out of the frame by a chain fall. For the next 2 weeks, Frank's evenings were spent in that shop. After a full day in the fields, he'd eat a quick supper his wife, Martha, left for him, and then head out to the shed, often working until past midnight. He started the teardown methodically. He drained the milky, water-contaminated oil from the pan. He pulled the valve cover, revealing a sludge-caked rocker arm assembly. He unbolted the head, the one that had been sitting loose, and lifted it off. The news wasn't good. 2 of the cylinder sleeves were deeply scored, long vertical gouges you could catch a fingernail in. Water had been getting into the oil, and oil had been getting into the combustion chamber. It was a mess. "Looks like a complete overhaul," he muttered to himself, wiping his greasy hands on an already blackened rag. The talk at the Co-op diner the next Saturday morning was, as usual, centered on the weather, crop prices, and neighborhood gossip. Frank sat at the corner table, nursing a cup of black coffee. Harold Vance held court at the large round table in the center, his voice booming. "Just finished planting my corn," Harold announced. "That new 4430 is a dream. Pulled the 24-foot field cultivator like it wasn't even there. Got all 600 acres of corn ground, worked and planted in 4 days." A murmur of impressed agreement went around the table. 4 days was fast. "How you coming, Frank?" someone called out. Frank took a slow sip of his coffee. "Still got about 80 acres of beans to put in. The 4020's been running good." Harold chuckled. "Still messing with that relic you bought at the McAllister sale?" "The engine's out," Frank said evenly. "Blocks at the machine shop in town. Needs to be bored, new sleeves put in." "Good money after bad," Harold said, shaking his head. "You'll have $500 into that engine before you're done, and you'll still have a 30-year-old tractor that leaks oil and only pulls 4 bottoms. You could have made a down payment on a new 100-horse case with that money. Got to think about efficiency, man. Time is money." Frank just shrugged. "This way, when I'm done, I'll know every nut and bolt on that machine, and it won't owe me a dime." The conversation moved on, but Frank felt the weight of their judgment. They saw him as a stubborn fool, a man clinging to the past while the future was passing him by. He finished his coffee in silence and left, the screen door of the diner slamming shut behind him. The real test came that fall. The corn stood tall and straight, the ears heavy on the stalks. It was a bumper crop, the best in years. Frank fired up his old Gleaner E, its little 4-cylinder Alice Chalmers engine sputtering to life. It wasn't a big machine. It only had a 12-foot grain head, meaning he could only take 4 rows of corn at a time. But it was simple, and he knew its every quirk. He was halfway through his first 80-acre field when it happened. There was a loud bang from the right side of the machine, followed by a high-pitched squeal and the smell of burning rubber. He immediately shut everything down. The main separator belt, a wide, heavy-duty belt that drove the cylinder and straw walkers, had snapped. A clean break. He climbed down from the cab, his heart sinking. It was Saturday afternoon. The parts store in town was closed. The forecast called for a heavy thunderstorm rolling in Sunday night. He spent an hour trying to rig a temporary fix, but the belt was too far gone. He was stuck. From his field, he could see Harold Vance's massive new John Deere 6600, a silver and green giant, gobbling up 8 rows at a time in the field across the road. Harold was nearly done already. As dusk fell, Harold finished his last pass and drove his combine out onto the road. He slowed as he passed Frank's farm, his huge machine idling next to Frank's crippled Gleaner. "Having some trouble, Frank?" Harold called down from his air-conditioned cab, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Broke a belt," Frank said, not bothering to hide the grease on his hands and face. "Tough break," Harold said, though he didn't sound very sorry. "That's the problem with that old stuff, always letting you down when you need it most. Well, good luck to you." He put his machine in gear and rumbled down the road, leaving Frank alone in the twilight with his dead combine and the threat of a coming storm. Frustration and anger warred inside him. For a moment, he thought about quitting, about just letting the corn stand and rot. Harold was right. It would be easier to just sign a paper at the dealership and have a new, reliable machine delivered. But then he looked at his hands, calloused and stained, and he looked at the field, the product of his year's labor. He wasn't a quitter. He walked back to the workshop and began to rummage. In a dark corner, under a pile of old canvases, he found what he was looking for. A length of heavy baler, belting he'd salvaged from a junked New Holland years ago. It was the right width, but it was old and stiff. He spent the next 4 hours in the shop. He cut the belting to the precise length. He drilled holes in the ends, carefully measuring the spacing. Using a set of belt fasteners and a special tool that looked like a giant pair of pliers, he painstakingly clamped the metal teeth into the belt ends, joining them together. His hands ached, and his eyes burned from staring at the small metal parts under the dim light. Finally, just after 2 a.m., it was done. He carried the heavy, makeshift belt out to the combine. It took him another hour, wrestling the stiff belt over the pulleys and tensioning it in the dark. By the time he was finished, the first hints of dawn were breaking in the east. He was exhausted, every muscle screaming in protest, but he climbed into the cab and turned the key. The engine fired up. He engaged the separator. The new belt held. It slapped a bit, not as smooth as a factory belt, but it held. He combined all day Sunday, racing the storm. The clouds gathered on the western horizon, dark and bruised looking. The wind picked up, making the cornstalks rustle and sway. He didn't stop, not even to eat. He just kept his eyes on the field, the dust and chaff swirling around him. The rhythmic clatter of the old machine a song of defiance. He finished the last pass and pulled the gleaner onto the headland just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. He had done it. The crop was in. It was a victory that no one else would ever see or understand. A quiet battle won in a lonely field against time, weather, and his own doubts. The next few years were a blur of prosperity that proved Harold Vance right, at least on the surface. The grain embargo against the Soviet Union was lifted, and in '72, the Russians began buying American grain on an unprecedented scale. Prices for corn, wheat, and soybeans shot through the roof. Land values, which had been climbing steadily, suddenly exploded. A wave of optimism, bordering on euphoria, swept through the heartland. The government was encouraging it. Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz was on the radio, telling farmers to get big or get out, to plant fence row to fence row, and the banks were more than happy to help, offering loans with what seemed like impossibly easy terms. For men like Harold Vance, it was a golden age. The high commodity prices covered the payments on his 4430 and his 6600 combine, with plenty to spare. He used his new line of credit to buy another 160 acres that came up for sale down the road, paying a price per acre that made old-timers gasp. He didn't stop there. He traded the 4430, which was only a few years old, for a brand-new international harvester, 1466. It was a beast of a tractor, its turbocharged diesel engine letting out a throaty roar that could be heard a mile away. It had dual rear wheels and a decal on the side that proudly proclaimed 145 horsepower. Harold was now farming close to 5,500 acres. He built a massive new machine shed, a gleaming steel structure that dwarfed his house, and next to it, a towering new grain leg and drying system. He was the king of the county, the embodiment of the new, aggressive American farmer. His success was undeniable, and his disdain for Frank's methods grew into a kind of patronizing pity. Frank felt the boom, too. The checks he got from the elevator were bigger than any he'd ever seen, but his reaction was different. He saw the soaring prices and land values not as a new, permanent reality, but as a temporary fever. He remembered his father's stories of the Depression, of neighbors who had lost everything because they'd overextended themselves in the good times of the 1920s. So Frank didn't change a thing. He took his profits and, after paying his taxes and setting aside money for next year's seed and fertilizer, he marched into the First National Bank of Fairfield and put the rest into certificates of deposit. He bought no new land. He bought no new equipment. He did, however, finally finish the engine rebuild on the old farmall M. He'd painted it himself, a fresh coat of IH red, and it now sat proudly in his shed, ready for light duty. It ran like a top. The total cost of the project, including the machine shop work and new parts, was just under $600. His conservatism was now seen as more than just stubbornness. It was seen as a profound failure of imagination. At the diner, Harold would hold court. "Poor old Frank," he'd say, shaking his head. "He's like a man who's been handed a winning lottery ticket and is afraid to cash it. This is the opportunity of a lifetime, and he's putting his money in a CD earning 5%, while my land value just went up 30% last year alone. He just doesn't get it." The other farmers would nod in agreement. Frank was being left behind. He was a relic, an artifact from a bygone era. His debt-free farm, once a point of pride, was now seen as a sign of his lack of ambition. He became more isolated, content to work his own land, maintain his old iron, and trust his own instincts. One crisp afternoon in the fall of 1978, Frank went to the bank to roll over one of his CDs. The lobby was busy. Farmers, flush with cash from another good harvest, were talking about expansion, about buying the new four-wheel drive tractors that were just coming out. As he waited in line, he saw Harold Vance over in the loan officer's cubicle, laughing and signing a stack of papers. Frank finished his business and was about to leave when he overheard a young farmer talking nervously to the bank president, Mr. Abernathy. "I'm just a little worried about this variable interest rate, Mr. Abernathy," the young man said. "What if it goes up?" Abernathy gave a reassuring, fatherly smile. "Now, son, don't you worry about that. That's just a formality the federal regulators make us put in there. The prime rate hasn't moved more than a point or two in 10 years. This is a stable economy. You go on and buy that new combine. You can't make money if you're broke down in the field." Frank felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He glanced up at the board on the wall that listed the current rates. Prime rate, 9%. 6-month CD, 7.5%. He remembered a time not long ago when those numbers had been half that. He walked out of the bank and stood on the sidewalk, the afternoon sun feeling suddenly cold. Across the street, parked in front of the implement dealership, was Harold's new pickup, a shiny Ford F-250 Lariat, loaded with every option. On the horizon to the west, a bank of dark, heavy clouds was massing, the kind that held not rain, but hail and wind. The whole world was celebrating the sunshine, but Frank was the only one who seemed to be watching the storm. The first tremor came in the winter of '79, a shockwave that started in Washington and rippled across the plains. Frank heard the news on the radio in his workshop, the announcer's grave voice cutting through the hiss of the propane heater. President Carter, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, had announced an embargo on grain sales to the USSR. The market that had been the engine of their prosperity, the insatiable buyer of their corn and wheat, was gone overnight. The price on the Chicago Board of Trade plummeted like a stone dropped down a well. At the diner, the mood was sour. The confident talk of expansion was replaced by nervous muttering. Harold Vance, however, projected an unshakable confidence. "It's a political move," he declared, stirring 3 spoons of sugar into his coffee. "It won't last. The Russians have to eat. Besides, my operating loan for next year is already locked in. The bank knows my operation is solid." But the ground was shifting beneath his feet. The second, more violent tremor followed a few months later. To combat runaway inflation, the Federal Reserve, under its new chairman, Paul Volcker, began to aggressively raise interest rates. The prime rate, which had seemed high at 9% when Frank had noticed it a year earlier, began a relentless, terrifying climb. 10%, 12, 15. The first real crack in Harold's empire appeared that spring. He was pulling his massive 32-foot disc through a field, the big IH, bellowing black smoke, when a loud pop echoed from the tractor's drivetrain, followed by a grinding shudder that shook the whole cab. The tractor rolled to a dead stop, locked in gear. Harold tried the shifter, but it wouldn't budge. Something deep inside the transmission or the rear end had let go. The dealership sent out their top mechanic. After 2 hours of diagnostics, the verdict was grim. A bull gear in the final drive had shattered. To fix it, the tractor would have to be split in half, right behind the engine. It was a massive, labor-intensive job. The estimate was over $5,000, and they wouldn't be able to even start on it for 2 weeks. Their shop was swamped. Harold was furious. $5,000 was more than Frank's 40C20 was worth, and 2 weeks of downtime in the spring was a disaster. He still had hundreds of acres to work. He ended up having to rent a tractor from the dealership at a punishing daily rate just to stay on schedule. The cost of the repair and the rental ate a huge chunk of his operating capital, money he was already borrowing at an ever-increasing interest rate. Frank, meanwhile, chugged along. His 4020 developed a leak in a hydraulic line. He drove into town, bought a new hose and 2 fittings for $30, and had it fixed in his own shop in under an hour. He planted his corn and beans at his own steady pace, his only costs being fuel, seed, and fertilizer, all of which he had paid for in cash from the previous year's savings. That summer, the drought came. The sky turned a hazy, metallic grey, and the sun beat down with a merciless intensity. The corn, which had sprouted so hopefully in the spring, began to curl its leaves, the stalks turning a sickly yellow-green. Day after day, the forecasts offered no hope. The ponds shrank, their edges cracking into intricate mosaics of dried mud. The creeks ran dry. For Frank, it was a blow. He knew his yields would be cut in half, maybe more. But his costs were low. He would tighten his belt, but he would survive. For Harold, it was a catastrophe. He had borrowed heavily, betting on a bumper crop to cover his massive payments. A 50% crop combined with 30% prices and 20% interest was a formula for absolute ruin. The confident swagger was gone now. Frank saw Harold at the parts store one afternoon. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes hollow with worry. He was trying to argue with the manager over the price of a set of fuel injectors for his combine. His credit, once limitless, had been cut off. He had to pay cash, and he didn't have it. He left empty-handed, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The gleaming steel empire was rusting from the inside out, the pressure of debt and bad luck squeezing the life out of it. The king of the county was beginning to look like a pauper. Frank watched him go, feeling not a shred of triumph, but a deep, hollow ache of pity for a man who had flown too close to the sun. The fall of 1981 was a season of ghosts. The harvest was a grim, dusty affair. The combines pulling in yields that were a mockery of the land's potential. The price of corn hovered just over $2 a bushel, a price that wouldn't have been profitable even in the best of years. For farmers leveraged to the hilt, it was a death sentence. The letters from the bank started arriving like funeral notices. Frank saw the crisp white envelope from First National in Harold's mailbox one afternoon as he drove by. He could imagine the words inside, the cold, formal language that could shatter a man's world. The prime interest rate had peaked at an unbelievable 21.5%. The variable rate loans that had fueled the boom of the 70s had become instruments of torture. Payments that had once been manageable had ballooned into impossible sums. The community, once bound by a shared sense of optimism, was now fractured by fear and suspicion. The talk at the diner was no longer about horsepower and yields, but about who was in trouble, who had missed a payment, who was next on the bank's list. Mr. Abernathy, the bank president who had once cheerfully handed out loans, now walked through town with his eyes fixed on the pavement, avoiding the gazes of the very men he had encouraged to borrow. Harold Vance fought it. He tried to sell off some of his newer equipment to raise cash, but the market was flooded. A tractor that had cost $40,000 2 years ago couldn't fetch $15,000 now. He tried to sell the 160 acres he had bought at the peak of the boom, but land values had collapsed by more than half. There were no buyers, only other desperate sellers. He was trapped. The foreclosure notice was published in the county paper in the spring of '82. It was a small block of text filled with legal jargon, but its message was stark and brutal. The entire Vance operation, 1,200 acres, the house, the new machine shed, the towering grain bins, and every piece of equipment would be sold at public auction on the courthouse steps. Frank survived the drought and the price collapse because his foundation was solid rock, not shifting sand. His break-even point was so low that even with a poor crop, he still covered his costs with a little left over. He didn't make much money, but more importantly, he didn't lose any. His old iron, paid for and maintained by his own 2 hands, was his salvation. One cool morning, the battery in his 4020 was dead. Instead of calling for a service truck, he simply walked over to the Farmall M, the $100 junker he had resurrected. He put a hand crank into the front of the engine, gave it a quarter turn to prime it, and then gave it a sharp, powerful spin. The old engine coughed once, twice, and then roared to life in a cloud of blue smoke. He used it to pull start the bigger John Deere and was in the field an hour later. The total cost of the repair was $0. It was a small moment, but it was everything. It was freedom. He saw Martha watching him from the kitchen window that morning, a worried look on her face. "Are we going to be all right, Frank?" she asked him later, her voice barely a whisper. He took her hands, his rough and calloused, hers soft from years of homemaking. "We're fine," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "We don't owe anyone a thing, Martha. We own this land. We own our home. We own our machines. They can't take what's already yours." In a world that was crumbling around them, that simple truth was the only thing that mattered. The day of Harold Vance's auction was cold and grey, a miserable day in late March that promised rain but refused to deliver. A raw wind whipped across the courthouse lawn, forcing the 100 or so men gathered there to huddle deep in their coats. They were mostly farmers, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the crowd. They were here not just as spectators, but as vultures and potential victims, here to pick at the bones of a fallen neighbor and to see their own possible future played out before them. Frank stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands in his pockets. He hadn't wanted to come, but he felt he owed it to the memory of Harold's father, a good man he had respected. He saw Harold standing near the steps with his wife, both of them looking pale and shrunken, aged a decade in a single year. Harold stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some distant point, refusing to meet the gaze of the men who had once envied him. The auctioneer, a man Frank didn't recognize from out of town, began his chant. He was a professional, his voice devoid of emotion, as he methodically dismantled a man's life, piece by piece. The big IH 1466, Harold's pride and joy, sold for $12,000 to a corporate farm from Illinois. The John Deere 6600 Combine went for less than a third of what Harold had paid for it. The tools, the trucks, the grain wagons, all went for pennies on the dollar. It was a bloodbath. Finally, the auctioneer moved on to the land. It was sold in parcels. The rented ground was simply gone, the leases terminated. The land Harold owned was next. The 160 acres he had bought during the boom, the parcel that bordered Frank's own farm, came up on the block. The bidding was sluggish, no one had cash, and the banks weren't lending. The auctioneer started the bidding at $500 an acre, a quarter of its peak value. Silence. He dropped it to $400. A man from the back offered $350. Frank watched, his heart heavy. This was good black dirt, land his own grandfather had coveted. To see it sold for so little felt like a crime. $400, Frank said, his voice clear and steady. Every head turned to look at him. Frank Miller, the man who never spent a dime, was bidding on land. A murmur went through the crowd. The other bidder went to $425. $450, Frank said immediately, without hesitation. There was a long pause. The other bidder shook his head. Sold, the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking in the cold air. To Frank Miller for $450 an acre. Frank felt a strange mix of emotions. There was no triumph, only a grim sense of responsibility. He had just spent a significant portion of his life savings, the money he had so carefully put away during the good years. He walked over to the clerk's table to sign the papers, avoiding the stunned look on Harold Vance's face. The last parcel to be sold was the original 80 acres, the homestead where Harold had grown up, where his father and grandfather had farmed before him. It included the house, the old barn, and the new, empty machine shed. The bidding was even weaker for this piece. It was an awkward size, and the building's added expense. The bank's lawyer, anxious to be done, conferred with the auctioneer. The opening bid was a pittance. Frank watched as Harold's wife finally broke, burying her face in her husband's shoulder, her body shaking with silent sobs. In that moment, Harold wasn't an arrogant rival anymore. He was just a man who had lost everything. Frank stepped forward again. He made a single bid, a fair price that was still a fraction of its former worth, but enough to satisfy the bank. No one bid against him. The gavel fell again. In the space of 10 minutes, Frank Miller had become one of the larger landowners in the township. He didn't take possession of the homestead right away. Instead, he drove over to the Vance farm the next evening. The place was eerily quiet. The big machines were gone, leaving dark, oily rectangles on the gravel where they had once sat. Harold was loading a few personal belongings into the back of his old pickup. "Harold," Frank said, walking up to him. Harold didn't turn around. "Come to gloat, Frank? Come to see how the mighty have fallen?" "No," Frank said quietly. "I came to make you a proposition. That 80, the home place, I don't need it. I don't need the house. I want to rent it to you. You and your wife can stay. You can farm the 80 acres. The rent will be a share of the crop. Whatever you think is fair when the time comes." Harold finally turned, his face a mask of disbelief and suspicion. "Why? Why would you do that?" "Because your father was a good man," Frank said, "and because no man should have to watch his home be sold out from under him. You work the ground, you keep the place up. That's all I ask." Harold stared at him for a long time, his eyes searching Frank's face for some hidden angle, some trick. He found none. He finally looked down at the dusty ground, and his shoulders began to shake. The pride that had carried him for so long finally shattered, and he wept. Frank just stood there, waiting, giving the man his dignity as the last light of day faded from the sky. The years that followed were lean, but they were healing years. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving a scarred landscape and a generation of farmers who would never forget its lessons. The community's perspective had been irrevocably altered. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet caution. Talk at the diner was now about managing costs, about fixing things yourself, about the quiet power of a paid-for piece of ground. Frank Miller, once the stubborn fool, was now regarded as a kind of prophet. Men would seek his advice, not about getting bigger, but about getting smarter, about surviving. Harold Vance stayed on the homestead. He farmed the 80 acres with a small, used tractor he'd managed to buy. He was a changed man, humbled and quiet, but he worked with a renewed purpose. He and Frank never became close friends, but a deep, unspoken respect grew between them. One Saturday afternoon in the late 80s, Frank was in his workshop, his hair now mostly grey, his movements a little stiffer. His grandson, a boy of 10, was with him, handing him wrenches as he worked on the old farmall M. He was replacing a leaky gasket on the valve cover, a simple, satisfying job. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "why do we still use this old tractor? Uncle Dave says we should get a new one with a cab and a radio." Frank tightened the last bolt and wiped his hands on a rag. He looked at the boy, and then at the old red tractor, its paint faded, but its frame still straight and strong. It looked less like a machine and more like a monument. He put a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "A new tractor is nice," he said. "But a new tractor comes with a payment book. Every month, rain or shine, good year or bad, the bank wants its money. This old tractor," he patted the warm hood, "it doesn't ask for anything but a little grease and some gasoline. It works for us. We don't work for it." He led the boy to the big doorway of the machine shed and looked out. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows across the fields. He could see his own 320 acres, and beyond that, the 160 he had bought at the auction, the corn standing green and healthy. In the distance, he could see the roof of Harold Vance's house on the original 80. It was all a single, sprawling tapestry of dark earth and growing things. "It's not about how much land you farm," Frank said, his voice soft but sure. "It's about how much of it you truly own. This land, this iron, it'll test you. It'll break your back and break your heart some days. But it won't ever send you a bill. You remember that." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the weight and truth in his grandfather's words. Frank stood there for a long time, the smell of the earth in his nostrils, the quiet hum of a life well lived in his ears. The war was over. The victory hadn't been loud or glorious, but it was real and it was lasting, as solid and enduring as the old red tractor, standing silent in the fading light.